I'm Mike Papantonio, and this is Ring of Fire. American workers are getting squeezed financially and politically thanks to Republican union-busting efforts. But there's still some hope as grassroots organizations have now taken on the fight that unions once fought. We'll have more coming up. America's under attack by activist judges who've been packed into courtrooms under a decade-long Republican plan. Attorney Howard Nations is going to give us the details on that story. And the war on women, it continues, but this time the attackers are drug companies. We're going to be taking a look at two products on the market that have destroyed the lives of women all over the country. All that and more coming up, but right now, you've just entered the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
Decades ago, the Republican Party figured out that they don't have to win every election to be powerful. They learned that they could simply pack our court system with Republican hack judges that would serve on the bench for a lifetime. And because Democrats have been too slow to realize how important our courts are, we now have a judiciary that's skewed enormously to the right. Joining me now to talk about the Republican court packing scam is attorney Howard Nations. Howard, our president in the news this week saying that he has to do something about the lower courts and the Supreme Court. He has to do something about the Republican court packing that's taken place over the last few decades. Is it too little too late?
Well, better late than never, Mike, because this is an issue that direly needs to be addressed by this president. The presidential appointments are far more than just that occasional vacancy you get on the United States Supreme Court. There are 874 federal judges, and as vacancies become available in that judiciary, the United States Supreme Court has to give their advice and consent to appointments by the president. Presidential appointments have consequences.
Well, isn't part of the problem, Howard, that there's almost been, I remember Rahm Emanuel coming out and saying, during an unbelievable statement during Obama's first term, saying, you know what, progressives really don't care that much about judicial appointments. I mean, really, when he said that, it's a startling statement, because isn't the real problem that a president in a Congress can write all the rules and laws they want, but a court can take them away overnight?
Well, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court was quoted as saying, you can have all the best players in the world, but if you have the umpires, they're going to win.
And at this point, Howard, what we see is at this point, Clinton, I think, had to fight cloture, had to fight the filibuster one time where he had to ask for a vote on cloture. I think Bush had to do it one time. Obama, I think the numbers are something like 20 times he's had to call for a cloture vote where it comes to actually getting some of these appointees pushed through. And at first blush, you might say, well, that's a Republican problem, but it's not. It has to do with this president's desire to actually be an activist where it comes to appointing some of these judges that are destroying labor, destroying the environment, destroying women's rights, destroying political the political process. We're going to see them destroy voting rights here before long. And this president has sat back and acted like this just wasn't important.
Well, Mike, the important point you just made was this. President Clinton, as much as he was at war with the Republican Party for his entire 8 years, particularly his last 4 years, President Clinton had to face cloture only once because he got in there and he got the United States Senate, he put pressure where it had to be applied, and he got the United States Senate to move on his nominees. This president has not done so.
Howard, talk about, people don't understand, it's not just making Supreme Court appointments. You see, that's what gets the headlines. But the point is, if you make appointments at the lower courts, like the Republicans have completely, you and I, always appear in front of judges in the lower courts that have been appointed by Republicans. And you know what? It is always disaster for consumers. So it's not just about the Supreme Court. Talk about what the president of this country does as far as judicial inertia, just changing the court system.
Well, even if you and I go to court and we get a fair trial before a trial judge, we still have to take those cases up to the circuit courts. And the President of the United States appoints circuit court judges. He fills vacancies on trial courts, and he appoints the Supreme Court of the United States. The circuit courts, in our jurisdiction, for example, where I am, the Fifth Circuit, if you have a consumer, a plaintiff, an injured party, forget about it on appeal, because you are destined to lose. But you know, there's something else that the President of the United States does with respect to the Supreme Court. Elections have consequences. And imagine the President of the United States also selects the cases that the United States of America will bring before the Supreme Court. And then on those cases that come up in their normal course before the Supreme Court, the President, through the Solicitor General of the United States, can file an amicus curiae brief and put the position of the United States of America before the court, even on cases where they're not directly involved. So it's a powerful, powerful position, and it's one that you have to be actively and very proactively pursuing.
Well, that's what I find so incredible. You have 1/3. This is a startling number. It's actually a little higher than 1/3. But at least 1/3 of all the federal judges that are serving right now have been appointed by George Bush. Now, how scary is that? I mean, if you're a consumer and you're going to court against a corporation, maybe, Exxon, Dow Chemical, any of the big corporations, with this kind of balance in the court, I mean, the chances of a consumer actually winning, and all you have to do is look at the empirical data right now. Consumers lose most of the time with these new political, they're really more Politico appointments than they are judge appointments, but consumers lose. Why can't he, as a constitutional professor, I mean, he taught con law, for God's sakes, why can't he see the importance of making these appointments?
Well, actually, last August, I was in a small group that met with the president, and we discussed this precise issue with him. And his answer was, well, I just simply can't get anything through the United States Senate. And he said, I've been told, don't bother to send anything over. This was August last year. Don't bother to send anything over before the election, because it's not going to be processed. It won't be handled. It will go nowhere. That's the point at which Clinton, who got only one cloture vote, Clinton would push and push and push. This president has not. And the result is that the conservative base is much more energized and aggressive about the court than the progressive base. Rahm Emanuel, who was the right-hand man to the President of the United States for his first couple of years in office, said that we do not hold, we being the progressives, do not hold our elected officials responsible. We don't hold them accountable for they're just not doing anything about getting judges through the Senate.
In other words, it's okay, according to Rahm Emanuel, apparently this president, as far as progressives are concerned, it's okay to have the Republicans pack the court in a way that a woman can't get a fair trial where it comes to her rights on things like fair pay, or we can't get a fair trial where it comes to fixing the environment, or we can't get a fair trial when a corporation makes a product that kills somebody. It's okay with progressives that we don't get a fair trial, because really, when you drill down on it, that's exactly what's at stake here. The best example I can give, Howard, is here you have a president that worked and worked to pass health care reform. Where is it being disassembled? Not at the Supreme, partially at the Supreme Court, but also at the federal level. The federal appellate courts are disassembling it, aren't they?
They absolutely are disassembling that, but also consider progressive judicial inertia versus the conservative activism. On the conservative side, you've had Citizens United, created completely completely out of whole cloth by Republican-appointed judges, conservatives. The Civil Rights Act of 1966, Section 5 that you just mentioned, we're revisiting that. Unbelievable, but we're revisiting that at this point because of the extreme activism of the conservative judges. So progressives have got to stop tolerating judicial inertia because it works to our extreme detriment.
Howard, isn't one thing, and I am not very forgiving where it comes to these appointments. First of all, the appointments that Obama is, the ones he's making are coming from corporate America. Yes, they may be minority, they may be women, but they're silk stocking lawyers that work for corporations and have worked for corporations their entire career. Who do you think they're beholden to when a consumer appears in front of them? All they've ever known, all they've ever done is made money by being paid through a corporation. Yes, they may vote liberal on issues like race or other issues like that, but where it comes to really important issues, they are still corporate lawyers that have just been moved into those seats. I think where we're left is A, Obama is not going to be able to make any appointments, or B, the appointments that he makes, they're going to be basically corporate toadies, and that's what we're seeing. In a minute, what's your thought about that, Howard?
Well, my thought is this. We pay a lot of attention right now to how many women are on the court, how many African Americans, how many Asians, how many gay, lesbians are being appointed to the court. The one thing that I've heard not mentioned except from you, and we raised this with the president, is how many people are being appointed to the court regardless of those factors who are truly consumer-oriented judges. We have the white shoe corporate lawyers being appointed, and nobody seems to be concerned about that fact. We raised that with the president in our conversation with him, and he said, well, I can't agree with that because my wife was a white shoe corporate lawyer, and I guarantee you she would be a great judge for the consumer. So I said, okay, that's one. But what about any others? And that's a big issue that we need to move forward in the progressive movement towards getting real people who understand and represent the best interests of the consumer and the individual in America, because those are the people whose rights are being jeopardized and are being taken away by the federal judiciary.
Howard Nations, always out there fighting for the consumers. Honestly, one of the best trial lawyers in this country. Howard, thanks for joining me again. Next week we'll pick up, I think we ought to pick this topic up a little more next week, because it is a topic that is causing huge problems for this democracy.
Thank you, Mike. My pleasure.
Howard Nations is the past president of the National Trial Lawyers Association and a regular contributor to Ring of Fire. When we come back, we'll take a look at how alternative labor groups are standing up for American workers. I'm Mike Papantonio, and you're watching Ring of Fire. We'll be right back.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Unions in America have been under a steady attack from the right for the last 40 years. They've been demonized in the media and stripped of almost all their power to protect American workers. But in the absence of unions, new grassroots organizations have been popping up to help fight the battles that unions once fought. I've got labor reporter Josh Idelson here to talk about the rise of alternative labor rights groups. Josh, today in America, 7% of the labor force is unions. It's moved from 27% just several decades ago. Is there anything there that's filling that gap?
So in my feature at the American Prospect, I talk about one of the least understood, least studied trends in the labor movement in the United States, which is the explosion of these alt labor groups, these alternative labor groups that have grown up in response to our cramped, craven labor laws that have betrayed more and more American workers. As more and more workers don't even have the legal option of unionizing, we've seen other groups rise up that are also trying to figure out how you get leverage out of bosses, how you improve the conditions in the workplace, how you introduce a little bit of democracy at work. And these organizations have a tough road ahead, but they also have some quite impressive accomplishments at a moment when organized labor as a whole is very much on defensive.
Josh, we always like talking to you because you're always on cutting edges of issues like this. As you watch this develop, tell us where it is as far as development.
So in the early 90s, a Rutgers professor, Janice Fine, counted 5 alt-labor groups in the whole United States. More recently, the number is over 200. So there's been tremendous growth in groups from fashion models to farm workers to domestic workers to taxi workers, all of whom have been left out of U.S. labor law, don't have even the promise on paper of being able to organize a union. Now, other groups have risen up, organizing workers like restaurant workers, who on paper could organize a union, but as we know, the law, our economy, the rise of the union-busting industry, our politicians have made that often an empty process. So we see workers turning to other avenues for some of the same goals, being able to have dignity at work and being able to make a living wage.
Josh, tell me about some of the success stories where you've had this alternative labor force moving in, filling the gap where unions used to be, and to where we're seeing some actual movement on behalf of the worker.
So one of the most striking victories I write about at the American Prospect is the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. Taxi workers in New York used to be considered employees, 1/6 of them used to be unionized, and then they were changed by the law, stepped in, began to consider them as independent contractors. People were stripped overnight of their union rights, of their health care, of their retirement, and workers had to claw it back over many years. What they did that most of these alt-labor groups haven't pulled off, that many unions don't pull off, is they went on strike. The taxi workers in the late 90s essentially shut down their industry for a day in a massive show of industrial force, of their ability to keep people from getting from one place to another in a taxi, and that made them a force to be reckoned with. At that point, once they had used that workplace activism of going on strike, then they were able to build serious political clout, go through the Taxi and Licensing Commission of New York, which they had always seen as an enemy, as something that made their job harder. They were able to turn that regulatory commission into something approximating collective bargaining. So they found
what we're seeing, Josh, it seems like there are some actual advantages that this alternate workforce may have that unions don't have. For example, they can't engage in collective bargaining. Yes, they don't have organized officers and elections. They don't have a centralized system of funding the movement, but they can do some things that unions can't do from what I'm reading in your article. Tell us what those are.
That's right. And it's worth noting there are plenty of disadvantages these groups face, but there are some real advantages. And in fact, the Restaurant Opportunities Center, which organizes restaurant workers, has fought at the National Labor Relations Board, at the government, against being considered a union because it was the bosses, it was the restaurant industry who went to the government and said, these guys are protesting us. We want you to apply all these restrictions on union pickets to this group because we say they're a union. So it shows you that being considered a union under the law in the United States is not always a good thing for workers. It brings a lot of benefits, but it brings restrictions.
Is this something we're seeing with Walmart? Give us an idea. What are the parallels here with Walmart?
Sure. So the labor uprising at Walmart involves also alt-labor groups. Warehouse workers who are not a union are backed by a union but are organizing in a workers' center. Similarly, the retail workers, the group R Walmart, is very much began as a project of and remains strongly linked to the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, but is not asking for an election, is not demanding collective bargaining, is not asserting itself as a union under the law, but instead is using tactics like going on strike, groups of workers going together to confront a manager, going to the media, getting support from politicians, reaching out to customers, attacking the company's brand, holding demonstrations. And these tactics, which unions also use, are the palette of tactics that characterize all of these alt-labor groups.
It would seem, Josh, that that the progressive movement would be out there providing funding. In other words, even though you have these movements that, unlike a union, don't have centralized funding, it seemed like you would have more than a few progressive movements saying, we like that Walmart is out there trying to rebuild a middle class. Do you see that element of events taking place here?
These alt labor groups are generally not primarily funded by dues from members. The Taxi Workers Alliance is the only one I studied that gets the majority of its funding from members. So many of them rely on foundations for funding, rely on unions for funding, and there is a limitation there, because let's say your working conditions are abysmal and illegal, and you're able to fight and agitate and organize and get them up to just being bad, that foundation might move on and decide to go fund something else. So there is a vulnerability there. But yes, foundations and unions provide a huge portion of the funding for these organizations.
Potentially, as I look at this story, Josh, that you've just done such a great job writing about and following and presenting, as I look at this story, I see the potential for some of the loss of America's labor union to be replaced. For example, a union can't organize a boycott. There are laws against their ability to do that in some situations. This is an organization that could. If you have farm workers, for example, I followed your story, there's a couple of instances where you have them actually organizing boycotts that have gotten some results. Talk about that.
That's right. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers, one of the oldest alt labor groups, is a great example where you have farm workers who legally are employed by these anonymous companies no one's heard of at one end of a supply chain, that when you follow the chain, when you follow the tomatoes and you follow the money, they end up at supermarkets, they end up at fast food restaurants. And the way that the CIW has been so effective is putting pressure on everybody in that chain. But that includes the fast food companies. They had, for example, a many-year boycott of Taco Bell, which really laid the groundwork for everything they've done since then. If they were a union, they would face all kinds of legal restrictions on their ability to boycott Taco Bell.
It would seem to me the AFL-CIO, other big union organizations would be delighted to see this occurring. Are the organized unions actually helping this movement?
You know, early on there was a lot of skepticism and distrust. At this point, absolutely, the AFL-CIO and Change to Win, both of these labor federations, are partnering with these groups. In some cases, they've chartered them as official members of the AFL-CIO. One official at the AFL-CIO who I talked to for the story said, you know, these groups often are movements in search of institutions, and unions, frankly, are often institutions in search of movements. And so we see much more collaboration now.
Isn't the real question, Josh, how will this play out in kind of non-urban areas? In other words, I can see, for example, workers, maybe even domestic workers. Let's talk about domestic workers in New York City, for example. The numbers that I saw reported in your story were there's an estimated 200,000 domestic workers up in New York, but only 10,000 of them are members of this alternate labor organization called DWU, right? And the question then becomes, how does this same thing play out in places outside New York and in bigger urban areas?
That's a good question. And even in California, a bill like the landmark bill, the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights that was passed in New York, a similar bill was vetoed in California by Jerry Brown, a Democratic governor. And so when the question is Texas or Arkansas, it becomes daunting. What we will see in these places, though, is these groups will have to be strategic about which of the tactics they use from their palette. So, for example, where you're less likely to get support from local politicians, it may be that much more important to be able to go on strike or to be able to get clergy allies, to bring in churches, or to be able to partner with immigrant rights groups. But certainly there's a daunting path. And the truth about these alt labor groups is they have certain tactics they can use more easily than unions. They have certain advantages. But ultimately, they're facing the same basic challenges. The fact that U.S. law is broken when it comes to protecting workers, and the fact that companies all too often turn to retaliation, because if you can terrorize a large group of workers by firing one or two leaders, that can be a great investment unless somebody punishes you for it. At Walmart, we've seen the workers are not turning to the law to punish Walmart for retaliating. They're going on strike. And they're going on strike in numbers like we've never seen at Walmart in the United States.
Josh, in just a minute, tell me this. I'm sure that these workers are being subjected to the same kind of pushback that we've seen in the early labor movements. It's probably even worse at some points. Are you seeing that?
There's absolutely rampant allegations of retaliation. I talk in the story about the example of the Restaurant Opportunities Center's fight with Darden, where I talked to a worker who is quite pessimistic about what's happened to some of his coworkers who were involved early on and wanted to fight the company, and then started to see people getting picked on and picked off. So it's a long road ahead, but the phenomenon of the victories these groups have won means that people in the labor movement should be watching.
And you think at this point that the support from the unions themselves will continue?
I think it will. I mean, we're at a moment, the reports out of the AFL-CIO Executive Committee meeting last week reinforced this. We're at a moment where there's a growing recognition that there is a real question about whether we will have union members in the United States several decades from now if the trend line that we're on now continues. And so that is forcing an openness in some places that weren't so open to taking risks and pursuing some other models.
Josh Adelson, thank you for joining us as usual. You are at the front of this story, and we'll follow it as you develop it.
Thank you very much.
Josh Adelson is a labor reporter for Salon.com and The Nation. Coming up, we'll take a look at how big box retail stores are squeezing workers to the breaking point. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Tune into Free Speech TV for Democracy Now!, a national, independent, award-winning news program bringing you people and perspectives rarely seen on corporate media.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. As recently as 40 years ago, the ratio of CEO's pay to a worker's pay was 29-1. But today, the average CEO makes $380 for every dollar a worker makes. And this income disparity is even worse for big box retail workers. They continue to get squeezed by their employers. Joining me now to talk about the pain being felt by American workers and how they might fight back is Alternet senior writer Josh Holland. So Josh, Walmart has figured out that if you don't pay people money, they can't buy things. Isn't the story that you've done here is the ravage of capitalism? I don't know why they missed that for so long. Tell us about it.
Well, I mean, this is the most dismal first quarter that they've had in years and years and years and years. And Bloomberg released a bunch of internal correspondence between big muckety mucks over at Walmart, and they were like, "Where are our customers and where is their money?" And the answer to that question comes in a couple of different places. First of all, we had, as a result of the fiscal cliff deal, you remember when we had that election and Obama said that taxes on the middle class wouldn't rise and he'd let taxes go up a little bit on the wealthy? Well, that didn't work out exactly the way it was planned and promised. People
like so many things lately, Josh, I'm afraid. But anyway, go ahead.
Across the board, working people, they got a tax hike when the payroll tax cut expired, and this is hurting everybody. We've had stagnant incomes in the bottom 90%, the vast majority of American workers for 30 years, and we finally come to a point, perhaps, where we're seeing that they can't even afford those very, very cheap prices for the goods that Walmart produces in China and elsewhere and reimports for sale here.
You know, Josh, I think it's interesting. Probably if I were to trust the metrics, if I were to evaluate the metrics between the U.S. government and Walmart and who understands the most about what's getting ready to happen to the economy, I'd line up with Walmart every time because they probably have a more sophisticated system. What is that system showing anybody who's paying attention right now?
Well, that's exactly right. They have such fine, detailed data that they actually are better forecasters for the economy than the forecasting bureaus that the government does, and also Wall Street's forecasting bureaus. And they're looking at very rocky times ahead for a very good reason. Look, this isn't rocket science. We had an amazingly devastating crash. Unemployment skyrocketed. Americans lost trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of accumulated wealth wealth that they'd had in their homes and their IRAs, and they couldn't buy anything. This is the fundamental problem with our economy. This is why we have such a sluggish recovery. People don't have dollars in their pockets to spend on the goods and services that keeps the whole engine running. Remember, this is an economy, 70% or so is driven by consumer spending. So what happens when Americans are tapped out?
Well, so interestingly enough, if you your article talks about 62% of all the gains that we experienced between 1993 and 2011, 62% of those gains went to the top 1% of Americans. Now, the bad news for Walmart is that 0.5%. I'm sorry, my friends, but they don't shop at Walmart. They don't shop at Target. They shop in other places. And so you have the Walmarts. It's like a wake-up call. Say, gee whiz, only that 1% has the money. Isn't that a factor here?
I mean, it's great for Hemmicker Schlemmer. But yes, you're absolutely right. The people who shop at Walmart are not those at the top of the wage distribution. And look, that statistic you just cited, it's much worse since the beginning of the recovery. Those in the top 1% of households have actually taken in over 100% of the gains made since the recovery officially started in 2009. What does that mean? The rest of us, the 99% that we heard so much about during the Occupy Wall Street movement, we've lost ground in this recovery. So, you know, it looks like, at least for Walmart and other low-end retailers, that the chickens are finally coming home to roost.
Cheap things made in China don't have any appeal to the top 1%. That's one of the things that's come home to roost. Maybe the second thing that's come home to roost is maybe we ought to be worried about spinning this economy up and employing people and fixing some of the real problems rather than worrying about this deficit boogaboo. Give me your thoughts on that.
I worry that the deficit is too small. And this is the perspective that you never hear in the mainstream discourse. Right now, we should be focused, we should have a laser-like focus on repairing a really, really damaged labor market and getting wages up. And if you look at even this very modest proposal that Obama made during the State of the Union address to lift the minimum wage up to $9, which is not an enormous amount of money per hour, that was met with vociferous opposition. It was dead on arrival at the Hill. Republicans rejected it outright. Even some Democrats said that it wasn't a great thing for the economy. But we have study after study that shows that that boosts wages and does not affect employment. These are the things that we need to be doing right now, while demand in the consumer demand and private sector demand remains in a slump. We need to be boosting that. When you get people earning a little bit more, having a couple of extra dollars in their pockets, they can go to the movies, they can go to, you know, Applebee's, and you get the economy humming again. And then you worry about the deficit.
Yeah, the truth is capitalism requires that there be money in the system. Isn't that kind of the bottom line here? When you take money out of the system and you give it to the top 0.5%, it doesn't move through the economy. And that's what Walmart has figured out. Now, something else that happens that you've written about a couple times, and it's brilliant, we miss it, but it's brilliant, and that is if you give all of the money to the top 1%, then who has the political clout in this country? Follow the money for me on that part of the story.
Well, I think this is an incredibly important story about our political economy in these days. You know, we've seen a massive shift of pre-tax income to the top 1% of households. And along with that increase in economic inequality comes an increase in political inequality. They have an abundance of money to spend on political campaigns. You saw it in this last election. This is especially pronounced now in the aftermath of Citizens United. It creates a vicious cycle where the interests of those at the top are being represented by, politicians in D.C. They get an ever bigger chunk of the pie, and they use that ever bigger chunk of the pie to buy additional influence, and the whole cycle repeats itself.
And isn't part of the problem is they go in as they buy that influence, Josh, it becomes institutionalized. They buy the influence in the court system. They buy the influence in Congress. They buy the influence really through the White House. I mean, that's what we're seeing here. And that influence becomes institutionalized to the point to where to turn that around, it takes some fairly dramatic events. Isn't that kind of what we're seeing right now? Isn't it almost institutionalized?
Well, I don't think it's almost institutionalized. I've cited studies by Larry Bartels, for example, that shows. He looked at the voting record of United States senators, and he said, well, look, it's interesting that their votes line up perfectly with the interests of those at the top of the pile. They also care to some degree about the middle class, but when you get towards the lower half of the economic spectrum, their interests are just not represented at all in our political world. So, I mean, this is a very dramatic thing that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it really should.
Well, one thing that you talk about in your article, I think, is it really tells a story, is that I think it's $26,000 per person in that 1% that gives to a political campaign, and that's just about the entire annual salary for many Americans. That kind of tells the story, doesn't it?
Yeah, and if you look at, who is giving, it is this, to political campaigns, it is this extremely narrow slice of the American electorate. It's, again, 26,000 people gave over $500, and this represented an enormous, I don't remember the exact percentage, but it was an enormous majority of all campaign dollars given in the last election cycle.
So, Josh, what has to happen before Walmart can sell their cheap Chinese products again to the average American? What has to happen from a macro standpoint?
Well, we have to get unemployment down and wages up. And it's really that simple. We've had a 30-year period where increasing productivity, that is the amount of goods and services that an average worker can produce, has not matched the incomes of those workers. The folks in the top little sliver of the economic pile are taking all those productivity gains. And when we can get to the point where we're, again, sharing them throughout the economy, that will reestablish American prosperity, and nothing else will. How do you get there? Well, you do things like looking very hard at our trade agreements and making it easier for people to bargain collectively through unions or otherwise. It's not rocket science. We can look at other countries. We can look at countries with less inequality and see exactly what they're doing differently.
Josh, let me ask you in closing, I'll change the topic just a tad. The sequester issue, I think people misunderstand. They think it's a wholly Republican issue. But if we're honest about what happens, this president had the opportunity, at least on 2 occasions, to actually vote against sequester and stop sequester. Did I get that right, or am I misunderstanding those facts?
Well, it depends on where your starting point is, Pap. I think that, it's clear that the White House came up with the idea of making this sequester to try to put pressure on Congress to come up with their grand bargain, which is probably not a great idea. But the thing is that we got to remember that they were doing this in response to the fact that John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, did not have enough votes in his caucus to raise the debt limit. So, it is true that the White House came up with the sequester as a means to kick the can down the road, but it's very important to remember how extreme it was to hold the country's debt limit to hostage in exchange for basically their ideological wish list, unpopular things with the public that Republicans wanted.
Josh, from a macro standpoint, if regardless of what happens with the sequester, if you've got, if it ends up with cuts, we're talking about losing 700 to 1 million jobs without question. Those cuts are going to affect those jobs. In 30 seconds, would you please tell me, did I get that right, first of all, and tell me why that is?
Well, look, this is what the independent forecasters are saying. That they're saying that it's going to shave a 0.5 percentage point of GDP growth. And remember, this is already an extremely slow, anemic recovery. We're taking dollars out of people's pockets yet again. We're taking money out of the economy at a time when the government can borrow money for nothing and put it into the economy and get people working. It's exactly the wrong policy at the wrong time.
Josh Holland, as usual, there with the facts. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Pat.
Coming up, we'll be taking a look at two products that are destroying the lives of women all over America. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. In 2003, the drug industry found a way to increase their bottom line by hundreds of millions of dollars by aggressively targeting women. As a result, we've seen a flood of products that hit the market that are causing pain, suffering, and sometimes death for women all over America. I have attorney Robert Price with me now to talk about one of the newest products on the market that's harming women. Tell us the story.
Pap, about 2 weeks ago in New Jersey, a jury found that a transvaginal mesh product called the ProLift kit, a Prolapse kit, it's a piece of mesh, a large piece of mesh implanted in a woman named Linda Gross. The jury awarded her $3.35 million in compensatory damages and awarded a punitive damages award of $7 million against Ethicon, which is a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, for putting out a defective product.
Okay, well tell us, what is this product, and how do women go about buying it, and what should they know?
This product is what's called a pelvic organ prolapse kit. It's a piece of mesh, it's a large piece of mesh about the size of your palm that has been passed out to doctors around the country by large medical device manufacturers. And actually these products are being taken off the market currently. Basically since 2004, these products have been on the market being placed in the hands of OBGYNs, urogynecological clinics, being put in women to correct stress urinary incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse. These are conditions that are usually caused by childbirth.
Tell us how bad the damages are. Give us some examples of just exactly how bad these damages are and why women need to know about this.
What women need to know, what essentially happened is the same mesh that was used in hernia mesh, polypropylene mesh, began to be used in these pelvic surgeries. And then manufacturers began to mass produce devices. And what happens when polypropylene mesh goes inside a woman's pelvic region is that the mesh actually bonds with tissue and it begins to shrink and contract and degrade and harden, and it actually forms up a foreign body response. And essentially what happens is the mesh eats away at a woman's pelvic tissue. It hardens, it erodes, and it degrades a woman's pelvic region.
And what organs are affected by this, and what can a surgeon even do once it starts taking place?
The organs that are affected are the vaginal epithelium. It's actually the inside of a woman, and it's the surrounding organs such as the bladder neck, the urethra, the rectum, the colon. All of these major pelvic organs are being affected, and they're essentially being eaten away by this mesh. And what happens is once this mesh comes in, it never really can come out. The best a surgeon can do to correct the problem is to cut away at it, to remove it in pieces. And that is a long, years-long, painful process where a surgeon has to go in and remove this stuff over and over. And once,
so there's nerve damage, tissue damage, organ damage, muscle damage, And I think the woman that was just, the case that was just tried, she had 400 procedures to try to fix the problem. She was on 20 pills a day just to stop the pain and the infections that flowed from that. Is that correct?
That's accurate. She went to a doctor over 400 times because of this product to get, like you said, medications, clippings, removal surgeries, just years and years of pain.
Okay, so the reason this product was sold, it wasn't necessary because you had trained surgeons who could perform the procedure without mesh, and in fact had been performing the procedure without mesh for decades. And then all of a sudden this company comes on the market, Johnson & Johnson says, hey, we can make some quick money here by putting together a kit that every doctor can use, and that was a lie because every doctor could not use it adequately, could they?
That's correct. Essentially, the problems of pelvic organ prolapse and stress urinary incontinence have been around since the beginning of time. And what happened is these manufacturers, they saw an opportunity to make money. They saw an opportunity to make money and to put out a device that didn't need to be tested because of the FDA's kind of rubber stamp, what's called the 510K process.
Well, wait a second. Did the FDA ever approve this product? Did the FDA ever say to this company, you can sell this product?
The FDA clears products like this, but the interesting thing about this product and about Ethicon, which is essentially Johnson & Johnson's behavior, is that they didn't even go to the FDA with this product. They saw another product on the market. The first product that came out was in 2004 by a competitor, American Medical Systems, and before even going to the FDA, Johnson & Johnson just decided to put this thing out on the market and then go get clearance 3 years later.
And the FDA, if I got this right, Robert, the FDA came back in and said you have to do some testing and you have to prove that it's safe. And rather than doing that, if my understanding is correct, rather than doing what they were supposed to do in the first place, they simply decided to pull the product from the market, and now thousands and thousands of women have this product inside them. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. Last year, the FDA came out and said, "Look at all this data. Look at all this stuff that's happening to women. Maybe we should have required you guys, the manufacturers, to test this stuff." And then, instead of the manufacturers following through and finding what the true data would be, they're now pulling these products off the market. They've made their money on the victims that are now here, and they now...
And women are stuck with it.
Right.
Robert Price, no surprise here, just another ugly story coming out of the drug industry.
Right.
Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Pep.
Robert Price is an attorney and consumer advocate. The targeting of women by the drug industry that we just discussed wasn't limited to medical devices. In fact, one of the biggest cash sources for the industry is birth control. And they figured out that if they deceive consumers about their products, they'd be more likely to switch to new, more expensive means of birth control. Joining me now to talk about the dangers of some very popular means of birth control is Seth Katz. Seth, it sounds like it's another drug company looking at another product that kills another woman in the United States. What is going on? What is this with marketing drugs that seem to target women? This Yaz case is a case, stories just won't go away.
You know, Mike, this was a drug that really wasn't needed in the marketplace. It was a birth control pill, or it is a birth control pill, amongst many birth control pills that are safe and effective for women that have been around for years. This was an example of a drug company seeing that there was another drug company with an antidepressant making some money and saying, hey, we can fill that niche through a birth control pill and expand the number of women using the birth control pill. And
so, hey, Seth, when they came out with this, how many birth control options were out there that women could have used that did not kill them?
Scores of them, Pap, that had been around with proven forms of estrogen and progestin that had been safe and effective. But the problem with those, Mike, is they were available in generic. So the big brand companies weren't making any money on them.
Okay, so how did this Yaz product, this was Bayer Corporation, is that correct?
This is Bayer.
How did they go about taking this product and basically expanding the market to people who really, A, didn't need it, and B, were being lied to as far as what the product would actually do from an efficacy standpoint?
What they did was they combined a birth control pill with the approval for something called PMDD. 80% of the people that were polled on what that term meant and what that disease was, which stands for premenstrual dysphoric disorder, didn't know what it was. Now, 80% of women who menstruate know what PMS is. And what Bayer did was they marketed this product to treat PMS instead of the approved indication of PMDD. And in
okay,
fact,
let me be clear. The FDA had not given them any clearance at all to market this drug for women who were suffering from PMS, which is 80% of the public, but 80% of women. But they did give them permission to market it for people with PMDD, which is 3%. So Bayer calculated they couldn't make enough money on the 3%, so they did what they call off-label and expanded the right to be able to use it for everybody, made it almost ubiquitous, told all these women it was going to cure their PMS, which was a lie. Did I get that right?
That is correct. They did the math that you just did and realized that 80% was a much bigger swimming pool than 3% of the women who actually suffer from PMDD. And what they did was they spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars promoting this product in an off-label manner. So much so that the FDA came down on them after several years and finally said, you need to run a $20 million corrective ad campaign. And when Bayer finally did that, they thought it was funny and created a hoax video to show how sincere they were in trying to deceive the public.
The idea was to take the spoof video where they basically were making fun of women. At the time they made the spoof video, hundreds of women had died from stroke, embolisms, all different heart attacks, all different kinds of problems. Hundreds of women had died, but they never really took that seriously, did they? To this day, they still don't take that seriously, do they?
They never took it seriously, Mike. Thousands of women had suffered from these blood clots, whether it was a pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot in your lung, or a deep vein thrombosis, which has long-term, long-lasting effects of your circulatory system, or women who've had blood clots in their brain and strokes. I mean, these products, Yaz and Yasmin, and their generic version, which was also manufactured by Bayer, known as Ocella and Gianvi, have injured thousands of American women who should have never been on this product.
And the product is still on the market. The FDA had another chance to do the right thing. This is under the Obama administration. This isn't the Bush FDA. This is the Obama FDA. The Obama FDA had the right to do the right thing, which was to pull the product off the market. And instead, what did they allow the company to do?
In December of 2011, the FDA convened an advisory committee. And what that is a group of what are supposed to be independent doctors to come in and evaluate the product for the FDA and give the FDA a recommendation. Well, in this case, the advisory committee consisted of at least 4 to 6 people that we know of who had financial ties to Bayer. And in a very narrow vote of 15 to 11, the advisory committee recommended to keep the product on the market, but in a 21 to 4 vote, they voted to change the label. Now, that label change did occur in April of 2012, but by then it was too little, too late, and really the label change was weak at best.
So this is another situation. Industry makes a new product. They lie to the American public about the safety of the product. The FDA says, yeah, it's okay to lie, and it's business as usual as Bayer continues to sell this product, change the label slightly, but nothing's really different. Seth Katz, as usual, thank you for following this story. It is a story that affects all American women. I would talk to your doctor about Yaz, get the truth. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike.
Seth Katz is an attorney with the Berg Simpson Law Firm. That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com, on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio, and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll see you next week, right here on Ring of Fire.